What time is it? Oh, dang. I gotta put up some assignments. So, I know you guys are used to getting your assignments on Sunday, and I apologize for getting these out on Monday here today. My internet was down over the weekend, so had some issues there. Today, we're talking about the Cold War, and I want to talk to you about a few things, and I want to do this one just a little bit different. What I've done here today is your study guides, as you know, are going to be filled out using your slides that I post online. But I want to discuss some of the questions on your study guide, specifically the long answer questions, and that's what this video is going to do today. So if you actually wanted to pause this, open up your study guide, and start filling it in as we go along, it's probably going to save you a lot of time. So let's talk about these questions. So first of all, on your study guide, this should start at question 26, and I'm going to just go down the list from there and talk about some of these questions that will appear as long answer questions on your test, your last test. We are nearly done. All right, so the first question that you're going to see there is list and describe the 6 main strategies of the Cold War. So if you open up your notes, they're listed right there. So the listing part should be easy. We have brinksmanship, espionage, foreign aid, alliances, propaganda, and surrogate wars. Let's talk about these one at a time. So brinksmanship is this idea that I am going to, in a negotiation, threaten total war, threaten the absolute consequence, which is going to war, and in the Cold War, that means a nuclear war in the end. And that is the ultimate thing that neither side really wants to happen. But both sides use the strategy of trying to kind of appear, for lack of a better term, like crazy. Like they're just willing to push that button at any time if you go too far with them. And this could be used to leverage negotiations. So brinksmanship is this threat of total war to try to bring about the things that you want in a negotiation. Then we have espionage. Espionage is spying. So both sides, we have the CIA and the KGB. Many of you probably know Putin. Putin was actually the head of the KGB for a time. And both of these organizations, and these aren't the only organizations within these governments that are taking part in this, but both these organizations are set up to send spies, pay for information, find moles. If you ever heard of a mole, somebody who works within an organization like the CIA or like the government's missile programs, and they're willing to sell information that they know to the other side. So all of these different things, data collection, surveillance, a lot of things go into espionage, but it all comes down to you have spies and they are spying on the other side and reporting back what information they find, discover, by however means they come across it. They're reporting back to their own country. Next up, we have foreign aid, especially with the U.S., but both sides partook in this kind of strategy during the Cold War. The idea was we identify countries with problems, identify countries that both the United States and Russia could exert some influence over and direct them in the way that they want. And one way that especially the U.S. gained these countries' support and became their main partners rather than the Russians becoming their partners was through aid. We gave them money, helped them rebuild economies, help them industrialize, and show them that capitalism and democratic government is far better than communism. This was the idea, and to some extent, this was actually very successful. Next up is alliances. Both sides had their own alliances. The USSR had their Warsaw Pact, which was created after NATO. And NATO, or a lot of people accidentally say the North American Treaty Organization, is the North Atlantic. So it's talking Europe and the United States, Canada, North Atlantic or Treaty Organization. And this is a group of allies who are specifically, NATO is a group that is specifically created to help deal with the communist threat, with Russia primarily. And so NATO is created in response. Russia creates their own Warsaw Pact, which is a little bit different than NATO because Russia controlled all of these different countries that it was putting into this pact. So it wasn't really the same international style agreement that America was engaged in because Russia had direct control over most of these countries that were in the Warsaw Pact. Some it did not, though. Most notably like China and other things. So moving on, we have propaganda. So you guys already know what propaganda is. We talked a lot about that during several different sections talking about propaganda, but both sides engaged in very, very intense propaganda war, for lack of a better term, against each other to say about how bad the other side is, how awful it is. This is what your life would look under communism. If you see a communist, you need to report it. All of these different things that go into a propaganda war against the other side and making the other side seem as horrible and dehumanizing them as much as possible. It's usually the point of propaganda is to dehumanize your enemy and make your cause look just and correct. And then finally we have surrogate wars. Surrogate wars, Korea and Vietnam are the two main ones, but there's also Afghanistan. We supplied the weapons that the Afghans used to fight the Russians during their war back in the 80s. In fact, I used to have an old VHS copy of one of the Rambo films. I don't think it was the first one. It was one of the sequels. And at the beginning of that VHS, right there on the screen, the whole screen took up, said, "This is dedicated to the brave Mujahideen fighters fighting against the Russians in Afghanistan." And what's kind of funny about that is now if you buy a new copy of that message has been removed, partly because many of those Mujahideen fighters, and that was a group back in the 80s and they were fighting the Russians, many of those fighters went on to create other organizations like the Taliban and other things. And these same people, and also really important, is the same weapons that we sold and gave to the Afghans were the weapons that they ended up using on us during our war with Afghanistan during the 2000s. Well, that's still going on, but began in the 2000s. So, surrogate wars, the basic idea is that there is this country and we can both exert influence over it. And of course, we don't actually want to fight Russia, and Russia actually doesn't want to fight us because that's just death to both. So we're going to fight these other competitions by supplying weapons and intel and training to these countries, and they're going to fight a war, and that's why it's called a surrogate war. Like a surrogate mother is a mother that's not your biological mother, but it's somebody that takes care of you. A surrogate war, we are fighting with Russia, but indirectly we're funding these other people who are fighting each other, and this happens a number of times throughout the Cold War. And like I said, most notably Korea and Vietnam, but there are many other examples as well. So that covers the first on our list here, 26. So moving down to 27, it says describe the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift. So Berlin, as we mentioned earlier, after World War II, it was agreed that we're going to split up Germany and we're also going to split up Berlin. And Berlin happens to be entirely within East Germany, which is Russia's portion. So the other allies that aren't Russia all have pieces of Berlin that are completely encompassed by Russia's portion of Germany. And Berlin is eventually, the Russians get tired of this situation, and during a particular time where we're having disagreements internationally, they decide they're going to block off Berlin and try to force us to basically hand it over. We do not. And because rail travel and road travel is now blocked, because that's only possible through Russia's territory, our only option is to bring in supplies through air. And it might not sound so crazy today, but you have to remember this is the 1940s, and the technology is not the same as it was today. Air travel is not the same as it was today. And this was a very, very impressive feat that we were able to supply this whole massive city. You know, Berlin is not Greenville. Berlin is a massive, massive city. It takes a lot to keep it running. It takes a lot to keep these people fed, keep their houses warm. It just takes a lot to run a city. And they were able to do that with these airplanes. You know, we're talking about military cargo airplanes, not like the modern massive behemoth airplanes that we have today. And they're loaded down, and they are landing right after one another. I mean, you know, just minutes in between takeoff and, you know, landing is very close together, and it's very organized. And we are able to continue supplying Berlin for months and months. And finally, Russia decides to give in and reopen their rail travel and their road travel because of the optics and how this looked internationally. They were doing this, and not only were we beating them at their own game, but also it made them look like the aggressors, made them look like the bad guys, and so ultimately they withdrew on this plan. All right, Berlin Wall. So Berlin blockade doesn't work, so Russia goes to constructing a wall between their part of Germany and Berlin and our part of Berlin. So when people think of the Berlin Wall, they kind of think of just a wall that separates two things, but really what it did was completely encompass our part of Berlin to prevent people from getting in from their side and to keep people from getting out to their side. But mostly, it was really focused on keeping their people from defecting into Berlin because, you know, people noticed the standards of living were much higher in our section of Berlin than their section of Berlin. And that was its main focus, is preventing that travel from East Germany going into West Germany. So the Berlin Wall stood for approximately 30 years, and in 1989, there were some rumors circulated, and some Russian official made an announcement saying that the wall would be torn down, and the question that some news agency, some journalist posed to this person who made this announcement was when, and he said immediately. And that was a bit of a misstep because they didn't plan on doing it immediately. They planned on doing it in phases and very slowly. And ultimately what happened is that the people heard this and they went out and they went to go celebrate, but then the wall didn't start coming down. And people were wondering what was happening. People started to, okay, I was told it was coming down. Why is it not coming down? People are out partying, celebrating, but then it's not coming down. And ultimately, these people, mostly on the West German side, our side, they just start taking chisels and sledgehammers to the wall and start tearing it down themselves. They're like, well, they're going to tear it down anyway. We might as well help them out. And so the wall is actually breached and torn down by West Germans, and there are East Germans, there are soldiers, Russian soldiers, who are watching this Berlin Wall at all times to shoot people who try to cross it. And their orders are to fire on people doing this kind of thing, but ultimately there are so many people there. These Eastern Russians, luckily, they made the decision not to fire on this crowd that was tearing down the wall. And they basically stood by and watched the wall get torn down. So, that covers 28. 29. List and describe the three main events of the space race. So, or it says three main events. But I would argue that there are three main events. Like if you had to, boil it down to three, which I'm obviously making you, I would say there are three. If you put some other thing, like having the first woman in space, those are very big achievements as well. And that's fine. I'll accept those, but I'll just list off three here. So, 1, Russia launching Sputnik into space, kicks this whole thing off in, I think, 1957. You'll see in the notes if I'm correct or not. But I believe 1957, we launched Sputnik into space. 1961 then, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man in space. For the Russians. The Russians have the first, satellite in space, and then they have the first person in space, and they win a whole bunch of other more minor things. They're launching animals in space and all kinds of things. They're getting all kinds of achievements. And like I mentioned also, they have the first woman in space, which is a major achievement as well. You know, if we were going to expand this out to 4, I would say that was number 4. So they beat us in a lot of different areas, but in 1961, JFK gives a speech saying that we should be making getting to the moon a priority, and by 1969 that becomes reality, and we land a man on the moon, and Neil Armstrong is that first man on the moon. And that is kind of the end of the space race, because there's not much else to go for major new achievements after that point. Of course, today we're looking at Mars, but that is still, even with today's technology, still a daunting task. So the moon was a very impressive achievement for 1969. So that is kind of, you know, a lot of people refer to that as us winning the space race. Because we do get that big final achievement that nobody else can really top. So, those are the 3 main events. Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin, and Man on the Moon. 30. Describe the arms race during the Cold War. So, the arms race, let me pull up this graphic just so I have it to look at here. Oh, and the wrong one. Here it is. So, if you look in your notes there during the part where it talks about the arms race, there's a page just kind of full of graphics, kind of shows you some different comparisons. So the arms race is about more than just nukes, but it is also nukes. If you look at that chart, bottom right hand corner of like slide 13 on your notes here, you will see a little graph that compares the United States and the USSR in nuclear arms production. So we are in the blue, they are in the red, and you can compare that we start stockpiling much earlier and have huge numbers over the Russians and early, especially in the 60s and the 70s there, we have far outstripped them. And the reason for that massive uptick in creation, because if you look at that, we're over 30,000 nuclear warheads. 30,000 nuclear warheads. 30,000 nuclear warheads. That is a lot of nukes. We do not have that many today. There are not that many in the world today. Thank God. So, there are only... so the reason we started that ramp-up process is we had bad intel that the Russians, they were creating their own nukes, of course, and we had bad intel that they were ramping up production, and they were making all these nukes. So we decided to ramp up our production, and we were going to make, you know, more nukes than they can make, and, you know, keep this deterrence. Because if they have way more nukes than we do, they have a better deterrent than we do. Well, it turns out that information was wrong, but the Russians then get correct information that we are massively ramping up our nuclear production. And the Russians start there in the 60s and really ramping up through the 70s and 80s, creating massive numbers of nuclear warheads themselves. Both sides eventually move on from the types of nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and moving into hydrogen bombs, which are much more devastating, but also much cleaner, which is, I don't even know why I mentioned it, but when they blow up, they put less radioactive material into the environment than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs do, at least pound for pound wise, because they burn their fuel better. So the Russians jump all the way up to 40,000 nuclear warheads. So between the two of us, we have 70,000 nuclear warheads. And this is really what defines the Cold War, is this nuclear conflict between the two of us that's always looming over the top of our heads. Anytime one country could have something go wrong and think there's a missile being launched at them, so they launch missiles at us, and then because they're launching missiles at us, we start launching missiles at them, and that's the whole game. At that point, there is a nuclear apocalypse, and the world and society as we know it is over. Just absolutely devastating. If people survived at all, you know, into coming decades, it would not be the same. I mean, it would blast us back into the Stone Age, best case scenario. Worst case scenario, completely wipes out human life. So, This was just a constant fear during this time. But the arms race was not only just nukes, it was also other things. So if you notice on the chart on the bottom left, the Russians have like 3 times as many tanks as we do, but also America is a little bit better about decommissioning old things and only sticking with the newest and the best. Whereas Russia still today has tanks running around from World War II that would just be an absolute joke on the battlefield. So those numbers are highly inflated with things that just wouldn't work well in modern warfare at all. The same thing goes for their artillery there, right below the tanks. And Russia does have more soldiers as well, although ultimately a war between Russia and America would come down to conscription, which means, pulling people out of the general population through a draft. And America has a much larger population, so ultimately America would have the superior numbers that way. Aircraft is fairly similar, but again, Russia is doing that same thing. They're running still MiGs, which is a end of World War II, maybe early 1950s aircraft that really has no place on the modern battlefield, but they are still running many of those MiGs and counting them in their numbers. So the real stack up is very different than these numbers might suggest. And then nuclear warheads, comparisons, and things like that. So that is the arms race. All right, and 31, which is our last one of this, give 3 reasons why the Russians distrusted the U.S. and 3 reasons why America and its allies distrusted the Russians. So as we mentioned before, the U.S., France, Britain, we all opposed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and we did not directly fight against it, but we definitely opposed it. We supported the other side, and that right there, reason number 1, why the Russians don't trust the U.S., because we, from the very beginning, were against this idea of a communist state, and were actively working against their revolution. So, reason number 2, we did not invite them to the Munich conference. Before World War II began, we chose not to invite them to this conference, which decided the fate of Czechoslovakia. And they saw that as a major slight because they were allied with Czechoslovakia. And this is where appeasement comes in, and we gave Germany this huge chunk of Czechoslovakia, just to try to avoid war, and the Russians were not happy with not being invited to those negotiations, to that discussion. And then finally, for the third reason for Russia and not trusting the U.S. is that the slowness of us opening up that second front. We allowed Russia to do nearly all of the fighting of World War II for several years, and they paid for it. If you watched that video that I posted last week about the death toll of World War II, those Russian numbers just kept going and going and going and going. And then there's a pretty valid point in there. And I think we did that somewhat on purpose. We're watching, we're letting the Russians take the brunt of this for us. And why not? They aren't an ally. We're not super friendly with them. Heck, they made an agreement with Germany prior to the war to split up Eastern Russia. They're kind of getting what they deserve, right? And so we allowed them to take a lot of those casualties before we opened up the second front, and Russia was obviously not super pleased about that. So now we get into reasons why the West doesn't trust the Russians. So ultimately, right off the bat, communism is not a thing that a capitalist democratic society is going to like. Capitalism is, in its tenets, talking about spreading capitalism throughout the world. And there's this big theory, big fear, and a theory behind it called the domino theory, that if we allow one country to turn communist, then countries near it are going to fall like dominoes and fall to communism. So we have to do all we can contain this communist threat. And this is why we're giving all of this aid and fighting all of these wars. The idea is containment. If we can stop certain places from going communist, then we can prevent more communism in the future. So that is number one. So number two, the invasion of Eastern Europe was a big problem. So Russia invades Eastern Europe during World War II before the Germans attack them, and that is, obviously their intentions are to expand into this territory. Russia claims this is only for defensive purposes because they had been invaded several times during the last century, and they want this nice buffer zone of Eastern Europe, of friendly countries, so that they are not invaded again. But those invasions into Eastern Europe and destruction of different countries in that region is one of the things that we take issue with. And the last thing here is they are, of course, anti-democratic. These countries in Eastern Europe, at the end of World War II, there were agreements that they were supposed to be allowed to have free and fair elections. They were given elections, they were not free and fair, and the outcomes were all but a given conclusion that was what Russia wanted. So it's kind of like the elections in Russia today. Yeah, there are other people running for president other than Putin, but how do we know what those votes actually come out to? And if there is a candidate who is doing well, oftentimes they are scared, intimidated, and assassinated into not running anymore. So there is major anti-democratic themes in Russian-controlled territory, and that is the third reason why we are not big fans of the Russians. So that's it for today. This video is getting a little long. At the end of this video, I'll put up some student work from previous years just so you guys can see it, because we're not in class and you didn't get to see it. There's one that I actually have in my house hanging on a wall, usually right behind me. This was, I don't know if I should say who it was made by in the video since this is public, but two students who are seniors this year and will graduate made this behind me, and this was part of a project that you guys would have done if we were in class, but we're not. So, have a great time, and this is the last video you will see before the end of this semester. The semester is officially over on the 22nd. This week's stuff is due, of course, on the, let me check what day of the week that is, 18th. So on the 18th, Monday the 18th, this week will be due, and on the Monday the 18th, you will get your test, and that is the final assignment, and that is due the 22nd on Friday there, and late work can be turned in all the way to the 29th, and that's the end of the school year. We are there. So, have a good one. Goodbye. I'm in here at the school a little bit, and I wanted to show you a few of the really neat projects that kids have made over the years that, if we were actually in school, you guys would be making. Unfortunately, projects like this just don't make much sense during this time, but some very neat projects I've decided to keep. We got the Berlin blockade here and the Berlin airlift. Got the Cuban Missile Crisis, kind of an anime style. It's kind of neat. This thing is kind of cool. It's a shadow box. Let's see if this thing works for you guys. If I put the camera right up there, you can see a little earth in there. And if we do the other side, you can see, hopefully, let's see, a little man on the moon with an American flag. That one is very neat. I like that a lot. Let's see, we have another space race here. We've got monkeys and dogs in the rocket ships going to the moon. Sputnik. Sputnik going around the moon, it looks like, for some reason. Oopsies. We have a Berlin Wall. Little spiky stuff all over the top, and the tank traps, and the Stalin rosin, or Stalin's grass, like nails for people to walk over. We got another space race. We have a Kim Il-sung here. Let's see, we have another space race, kind of like a Soviet propaganda style. And then yet another little space race there. And if we come over here, let's see, we've got another Berlin blockade, and these two, both of them, they show the Candy Bomber. Was a U.S. pilot who was dropping candy bars and other sweets to children. And the children referred to him as Uncle Wiggly Wings, because to let him know that he was coming, he would shake the plane back and forth as he came in, so they knew which one was him. And we have one with the arms race here. This is actually their interpretation of a very famous political cartoon showing these two sides firing arrows at each other while behind them are sitting these deadly atomic bombs. Very neat stuff. Just wanted to share that with you. Hope you guys are having a great time.